attending. As Matt said, I am Oliver, and I am a fourth-year PhD student here at RIT, and I'm working at the Center for Accessibility and Inclusion Research, the CARE Lab. And today I'll be presenting my work on the use of automatic text simplification as reading assistance tools for deaf and hard of hearing users. And this is a human-computer interaction perspective on this work. And so before I jump into the main content of the talk, I want to give you a brief overview of my research. So I conduct research at the intersection of human-computer interaction and computing accessibility, with a focus mostly on tools that may benefit people who are deaf or hard of hearing. And a common thread throughout the projects that I've worked on is that the goal is to bridge the gap between users' needs, interests, and preferences for artificial intelligence-based tools and the researchers who are working on those artificial intelligence technologies that will support those tools. And so in that spirit, I've worked on projects, including the work that I'll be presenting today on automatic text simplification, which has been done at the CARE Lab. But I've also collaborated on a project focused on the video-based ASL dictionaries at the CARE Lab. And the focus there was mostly to inform researchers working on sign recognition in terms of what aspects of the output of those technologies may affect users' preferences for those systems. And with Adobe Research, I've also conducted some work on the captioning of non-speech sounds, with the goal of informing researchers in automatic captioning and also in automatic sound recognition about how to best consolidate the technologies to support automatic captioning of non-speech sounds in online videos. But as I mentioned, for the talk today, I'll be focusing on the work on automatic text simplification. And so the purpose of this talk is to highlight how HCI methods can benefit research in automatic text simplification. This is because there have been major advances in automatic text simplification and related natural language processing technologies, but much less research has been conducted with direct participation of users to understand their needs for these technologies or how these technologies can best be evaluated with, in user studies with these users. And so I want to highlight how research methods from HCI and computing accessibility for people with disabilities can support the researchers working on the automatic text simplification. And so before I jump into the studies that I'll be discussing, let me give you a little bit of background and motivation as to what is automatic text simplification and why that may be beneficial for deaf and hard of hearing adults. So automatic text simplification consists of natural language processing techniques that aim to rewrite text, making it simpler, but preserving the meaning of the original text and also grammatical correctness. And there are different approaches that can be done for automatic text simplification that vary in how much text they modify. So it can be done by restructuring sentences or phrases, which is called syntactic simplification, but it can also be done replacing individual complex words with simpler synonyms, which is also known as lexical simplification. And so accessibility research has explored the use of automatic text simplification to provide reading assistance to different user groups, including people with dyslexia, people with aphasia, or people who are non-native speakers of a language. However, less research has focused on deaf and hard of hearing readers. And so in terms of motivation, why may simplification be explored for deaf and hard of hearing adults? And so one thing is that nearly 1 in 6 adults in the United States are deaf and hard of hearing. And so it is a big subset of the population. But a key characteristic of this user group that motivates this work on automatic text simplification is that there is great diversity in literacy skills among this population, with prior studies identifying over 17% of deaf and hard of hearing adults as having low literacy, other studies identifying subsets of this population of high school graduates having 4th grade reading levels, and also research identifying lower educational outcomes, employment rates, and salaries among this population. And this is not to say that all deaf and hard of hearing adults have low literacy, while some may have age-appropriate, many have age-appropriate reading skills. This just highlights that there is great diversity among this user group. And one may wonder why not simply provide American Sign Language translation, why provide simplification? And while American Sign Language translation may be a great approach, there's a couple of reasons why it's worth exploring other approaches such as text simplification. And these reasons include that the state of the art for ASL translation is not yet sufficient to power translation in all websites online. And then another key thing is that there's great diversity in ASL skills among deaf and hard of hearing adults, with many people who actually don't use ASL. And so simplification may reach a larger audience. And then another motivation is that research on text simplification with non-native readers has observed benefits and preferences for simplification from non-native readers when they were provided with both simplification and translation. So there is motivation to also look into simplification for deaf and hard of hearing readers. And so for the rest of this talk, I'll be discussing 3 studies that we've conducted on this space using HCI methods for exploring automatic text simplification for deaf and hard of hearing adults. And I'll begin with a survey and interview study that focused on the reading experiences and interests in automatic text simplification from a specific subgroup of deaf and hard of hearing adults. This work was presented at the SIG Access Conference on Computers and Accessibility, the ACCESS Conference in 2020, and it was done in collaboration with Lisa Elliott, Becca Dingman, and Matt Unifeld. And it was titled Reading Experiences and Interest in Reading Assistance Tools Among Deaf and Hard of Hearing Computing Professionals. And so the motivation for this particular study on understanding user interests and needs emerged from the fact that prior work looking at the use of automatic text simplification as reading assistance has focused on measuring benefits from specific user groups, such as readers with dyslexia or aphasia. And this has mostly been done from after doing the text simplification, just providing it to these users and measuring whether there was a benefit. Other work has focused on identifying their linguistic needs, and some work has focused on the preferences for design aspects of reading assistance technologies. But little work has focused on this initial understanding of their interests and needs. And also prior work has not studied the interests and needs of deaf and hard of hearing adults on automatic text simplification, nor their current reading habits, which is also important to consider when investigating how to provide reading assistance. Now, natural language processing researchers have also highlighted the need for domain-specific user research for automatic text simplification. And so this motivates our focus on this study on deaf and hard of hearing adults with experience in computing, given that that's a field that often requires self-directed learning, often done through text-based methods. And so reading support may be helpful in those scenarios. So in this study, we explored 4 research questions, beginning with what are the reading practices of deaf and hard of hearing individuals with work experience in the computing industry? And this included questions regarding how much reading they're doing, how are they reading, for example, whether they're reading on a screen where automatic text simplification interventions can be applied, or whether they're reading on paper, and what purposes are they reading for? We also explored how much deaf and hard of hearing individuals in the computing industry engage in reading specifically for learning about new topics at work. In our 3rd research question, we explored the views of deaf and hard of hearing individuals in the computing industry regarding their experiences with complicated text and what they currently do to overcome complicated text when they encounter it. And finally, for our 4th research question, we explored whether deaf and hard of hearing individuals in the computing industry are interested in having automatic text simplification-based reading assistance tools, and if they are, what reading activities they will be interested in having those tools for. And so to answer this question, we conducted an online survey with 32 deaf and hard of hearing participants who had recent professional experience in the computing field. And then we also conducted follow-up interviews with 5 respondents from the survey. In this survey and interviews, we asked participants questions about their reading experience, but also about automatic text simplification technologies. And given that these technologies are not still in widespread use, we showed participants a video demonstration of how a text simplification system might work before asking them questions about these technologies so that they were familiar with what we were talking about. After the survey and the interviews, we quantitatively analyzed the closed-ended questions from the survey and conducted a thematic qualitative analysis of the responses obtained from the interview participants. And so before I show you the results, let me actually show you the video demonstration that we used for showing participants during these studies. And so let me walk you through what we found in response to our research questions. So beginning with the first research question, which focused on what are the current reading practices of deaf and hard of hearing adults in the computing industry, we found that over 75% of participants reported reading over 30 minutes a day on a screen, which is encouraging given that digital spaces is where automatic text simplification interventions may be provided. And in fact, participants reported reading significantly more often on a screen than on paper. We had also asked participants about what purposes they frequently read for, and work and academic purposes were among the most frequent purposes that participants reported reading for, which also motivates future work on natural language processing and domain-specific texts for text simplification, in this case, computing text, given that these participants are reading often for work and academic purposes. We also asked participants how often they were reading specifically for learning about new topics at work. And to answer this question, we also compared it to another activity that participants may engage in for learning about new topics at work, which is watching videos. Now, participants reported reading often for learning about new topics at work. And in fact, they reported reading significantly more often than watching videos for learning about new topics. The responses from participants in our interviews shed light into how people decide whether they want to read or watch videos for learning about new topics at work. And we found that reading was preferred for familiar topics or topics that are more technical in nature. For example, participant 4 indicated that when a lot of thinking isn't required, they prefer to watch videos, but P1 indicated that they prefer reading over watching videos when it's hard to memorize the concepts that they're talking about. Now, for our third research question, we asked participants about their experiences with complicated text and what they currently do to overcome it. Dictionaries and finding alternative texts with the same content were among the most popular workarounds that participants reported for overcoming complicated text. And this is interesting because it actually parallels both of the approaches that I introduced at the beginning for automatic text simplification, which is lexical approaches of replacing individual complex words, which dictionaries can help with, or finding alternative text, which aligns with syntactic simplification or rewriting the longer chunks of text. In comments from participants in the interview, we identified that vocabulary was a key source that participants discussed, a key source of difficulty that participants discussed, and they quantified the difficulty in terms of time. So for example, participant 2 indicated that when there's vocabulary that they don't understand, it takes time to understand. And participant 5 also indicated how much time it is consumed trying to figure out what a word means. So again, vocabulary being a key source of difficulty, and participants quantifying that in terms of time. And finally, for our fourth research question, we investigated participants' overall interest in having automatic text simplification-based reading assistance tools. And we found that overall, there was strong interest in having automatic text simplification tools, with over 50% of participants responding strongly agreed to the statement, I would be interested in a tool that helps me read by simplifying complex text. Now, we also asked participants about what purposes they would be interested in having these tools for, and work and academic purposes, which, if you recall, were among the top purposes that participants reported reading for, were also among the top purposes that participants reported being interested in having automatic text simplification tools for. Notably, medical and legal texts were also among the top purposes that participants were interested in having these tools for, which were not very frequent, but it sort of highlights the need for domain-specific research in automatic text simplification, whether that is the legal domain, medical domain, or computing domain in this academic and work purposes of computing, people in computing industry. So the contributions of this study include empirical evidence suggesting that deaf and hard of hearing individuals in the computing field read often on electronic devices to learn about new topics for their work, and they had strong interest in automatic text simplification tools. Our contributions from this study also include a prioritized list of workarounds that participants currently use to understand complicated text, the most frequent purposes that they read for, and the reading purposes that they will be interested in having automatic text simplification for. Now, for the sake of time, I did not discuss this in this presentation, but our paper also includes design considerations that are worth further exploring, including the autonomy that users are allowed in the user interface of these reading assistance tools which is actually explored in the next study that I'll present. But other considerations also included the accuracy of the automatic text simplification and the social acceptability of these reading assistance technologies. And I would encourage you to look at the paper for more details about those. Now, there were limitations and avenues for future work that emerged from our study. Specifically, we asked participants for their estimates of their reading habits, which may not be the most reliable way of getting their reading habits. So future work can focus on measuring their reading habits through other methods. And then we also focused on a very specific subgroup. So our sample size was not large enough for some analyses. For example, we identified some correlation with between participants' communication preferences, so whether they prefer sign language or spoken languages, and their interest in the automatic text simplification tools. But because our sample size was not large enough, we couldn't investigate that conclusively. And so future work with larger sample sizes could explore those relationships. And so that concludes that first study on the reading experiences and interests in automatic text simplification tools of deaf or hard of hearing adults in the computing field. And so now let me tell you about this project that we conducted investigating benefits of providing deaf and hard of hearing adults with lexical simplification, but also with providing user interfaces that varied in the level of autonomy. And this experimental study was presented at the ACM Conference of Human Factors in Computing Systems, the CHI conference in 2020. And it was titled The Automatic Text Simplification Tools for Deaf and Hard of Hearing Adults, the Benefits of Lexical Simplification and Providing Users with Autonomy. And this was done in collaboration with Matthew Zeta, Abraham Glasser, and Matt Unnerfeld. So the motivation for investigating lexical simplification among deaf and hard of hearing adults begin with the fact that, as I mentioned at the beginning, automatic text simplification technologies vary in the degree to which they replace complex words or restructure sentences or phrases. So whether we're applying lexical simplification or syntactic simplification. Now, prior work has observed benefits from providing deaf and hard of hearing adults with syntactic simplification, but prior work had not examined the benefits of lexical simplification among deaf and hard of hearing adult readers. And prior work on the literacy of deaf and hard of hearing adults had identified vocabulary as a source of difficulty, as was also mentioned in the previous study that I presented. And so it was worth exploring whether there were benefits from providing lexical simplifications to deaf and hard of hearing adults. And our motivation for exploring the autonomy that the user interface provides begins with the fact that prior work on text simplification as reading assistance has mostly focused on the text simplification quality and effects, not on the user interface of these technologies. But one study that was focusing on comparing the quality of these different text simplification systems found a preference for a system that provided on-demand simplifications. And so this highlighted that perhaps the autonomy that users have provided may affect users' preferences when using these tools. The importance of the visual design of reading technologies has also been explored in the space of text readability. So outside of text simplification, researchers have explored how varying the font size of text or varying the spacing can affect readability. So highlighting the importance of the user interface for readability. And so there's a need for more research on the user interface design preferences for automatic text simplification-based reading assistance tools among these specific user groups. And further motivation for focusing on autonomy specifically within the user interface is that providing users with more autonomy in their interaction with software, in general, HCI research has been found to increase motivation and the desire to use the software, but it can also increase complexity or cognitive load. So it's not always, the more autonomy doesn't always necessarily mean a better thing. But ethics, HCI, and accessibility work have advocated for allowing users to make their own choices when using artificial intelligence, only providing artificial intelligence services when needed, and moving away from paternalistic approaches in accessibility where services are applied automatically without any agency from the user. And so this sort of motivates this exploration of providing users with autonomy within these tools. And so looking at prior work on user interfaces for automatic text simplification-based reading assistance tools, we saw that these user interfaces varied in two dimensions that were related to autonomy. First, the level of control that users are provided to request simplifications. And second, the visibility as to what text or words have been replaced in this context of lexical simplification, what words have been replaced. And so with this motivation, the research questions that we explored in this study were first, whether providing a lexical simplification reading assistance tool affected deaf and hard of hearing users' perceptions of their ease in reading a text, or the perception of how well they had understood that text. And then the second research question, focused on autonomy, was whether deaf and hard of hearing users' subjective preferences about these lexical simplification tools were affected by whether they are provided with greater autonomy in requesting simplifications on demand, or having some visibility as to what words had been replaced. And so there were various possible factors for each of these variables. And so exploring all of the possible combinations would have been too many options for an experimental study. So we began with a preliminary study to narrow down these options. And in this preliminary study, we displayed a video demonstration of several user interface designs that varied in these two variables of user initiative or the visibility of what words had been changed. Within the user initiative variable, we showed participants demonstrations of systems that replaced words automatically, providing no autonomy to the user in terms of what words were requested. We also showed video demonstrations of a system that suggested which words participants could replace, which provided some level of autonomy that the participant would request it, but the system is still making suggestions. And then finally, giving the participant full autonomy to request whatever word they wanted without any suggestions. And then for the visibility variable, we had three conditions that varied in the level of visibility that they provided. One condition was providing a trace that a change had happened using a yellow highlight, providing no trace that a change had happened, or providing the simplified word as a pop-up or a tooltip that would appear above the complex word. And so as I mentioned, the goal of this preliminary study was to narrow down the option. And so we showed 12 deaf and hard of hearing participants high visual fidelity videos of these design variations that I presented in the previous slide. Participants discussed and provided feedback about each variation and provided a subjective rating for each variation on a 6-point scale. And basically the outcome of this project was selecting the top 2 designs from this preliminary study for inclusion in our main study. And so I won't go into the details, but in the next slide, I'll present which were these top 2 designs that we included in our main study. So in the prototype for our main experimental study had 4 conditions. The top 2 here were the outcomes from a preliminary study. So we had identified that a user initiative version that participants liked was providing the suggestions and also providing some visibility that a word had happened using these highlights. And so we combine these two, calling this condition the decoration because the text is decorated with these highlights. We also found that participants liked the version without any suggestions and providing the simplification as a pop-up. And so we combined these two versions of the prototype, calling it the pop-up condition. Now, in order to compare whether providing autonomy was beneficial, we needed a baseline in which participants were not provided with any autonomy. So we had an automatic condition where the text was simplified automatically without any input from the user, and there was no visibility as to whether change had happened. And we informed participants that the simplification had been automatically applied, but there was, again, no user initiative or no visibility that something changed. And then finally, in order to investigate whether there were benefits from providing the lexical simplification itself, we also included a condition of the original text without any simplifications. And so we also needed simplifications for this prototype for our main experimental study. And we followed a Wizard of Oz approach, which means that we had done the simplifications manually beforehand, and they were simulated during the study to appear that they were occurring automatically. In order to obtain the simplifications, we followed a semi-automatic approach that was performed by 3 human editors, including 2 deaf editors and 1 hearing editor whose native language is not English. And this was done with assistance from the system called PAR4Sim, which provides candidates for simplifications, for lexical simplifications. And then the simple paraphrase database plus, which helps identify complex words. And so the materials and the procedures for these experimental study included 4 texts from the Science Daily website. And each of these 4 texts was displayed in 1 conditions for each participant, and that was rotated across participants. After reading each text, participants provided subjective evaluations of the text, which included a statement that read, "This text was easy to read," and another statement that read, "I was able to understand these texts well." For both of those subjective evaluation questions, participants responded using a 5-point Likert scale of agreement, going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. We also included comprehension questions in our study as a way to keep participants engaged in their reading tasks. So they responded to comprehension questions after each text. At the end, participants also rated how likely they will be to use each prototype and provided rationale for their choices of why they would be likely to use a prototype or why they wouldn't be likely to use a prototype. And so in this experimental study, we included 25 deaf and hard of hearing participants. 10 were male and 14 were female, and 1 was non-binary gender. The mean age was about college age for the students, 23.5. 16 identified as culturally deaf, 3 as hard of hearing, and 6 as deaf. And then we also had participants respond to the English sentence comprehension subtest of the Wide Range Achievement Test, which has been validated as a way to measure deaf and hard of hearing readers' literacy levels. And so the participants in our study had an average score of 83.04, which is slightly below the average for the general US population of 100. And so the findings for our first research question of whether there were benefits from providing users with lexical simplification included significant differences for the statement, "I was able to understand this text well," between the original texts or baseline condition with no lexical simplification and the conditions that provided lexical simplification on demand. So this suggests that participants perceived the benefit from the systems that provided text simplification on demand, and here's what those look like as a reminder. For a second research question, which focused on whether participants preferred systems that provided them with greater autonomy, we found strong significant differences between the prototype that provided the simplifications automatically without any autonomy and the systems that provided the simplifications on demand. So there was a strong preference towards systems that provided greater autonomy. Participants' open-ended comments at the end of the study shed light into why this may be the case. For example, participant 21 really wanted the autonomy as a way to be able to learn new vocabulary. So for example, they said, "I like to know what words were originally used. I have no way of knowing what words were used when it was automatically simplified, therefore no way to learn." Now, if you notice, there were no significant differences between the pop-up and the declaration conditions, but participants' open-ended comments at the end of the study shed light into potential trade-offs that participants found between these 2 conditions. So these trade-offs included participants liking the fact that they could reread the text in their original version when using the pop-up condition, but some participants finding the pop-up condition distracting and thus liking the declaration better. So for example, P9 said that, "I like the pop-up more than the highlight option because it allows me to basically know the easier synonym for a difficult word, but allows me to reread the texts at the level it's at." But P4 indicated actually liking the declaration condition method because it allowed me to learn more vocabularies and it was not distracting like the pop-up. So there were trade-offs that participants discussed between these 2 conditions. And so in conclusion, in this study, we found that users perceived the benefit from designs that incorporated lexical simplification, and they preferred the designs that provided them with greater autonomy. Now, there were limitations and avenues for future work from this study. Specifically, we only studied lexical simplification, and so other work can explore syntactic simplification and autonomy, or using both lexical and syntactic approaches with deaf and hard of hearing adults. We also used the Wizard of Oz simulation, and so future work can explore how these findings may change when using realistic output from automatic text simplification technologies. And then we also only focused on aspects of the user interface design that related to the autonomy that users have provided. But future work could more fully explore the user interface design space of these reading assistance tools. And so that concludes that study focused on the benefits of lexical simplification and autonomy. And now let me walk you through a methodological study that we conducted on how to evaluate the complexity of simplified text among deaf and hard of hearing adults. And this work was presented at the CHI 21 conference with the title Comparison of Methods for Evaluating Complexity of Simplified Text among deaf and hard of hearing adults at different literacy levels. And this was done in collaboration with Jessica Trussell, Becca Dingman, and Matt Unifeld. So what is the motivation for this study? Focusing on how do we evaluate the complexity of simplified text with deaf and hard of hearing readers. As with any artificial intelligence technique, evaluation is an important part of the process. And in particular for automatic text simplification, evaluating whether the simplified texts are indeed simpler is an important part of the process. And this often relies on metrics such as comprehension questions or users' judgments about the complexity of the output. But the question is, can these metrics be trusted to measure complexity with deaf and hard of hearing adult readers? And in fact, prior work from our laboratory on evaluating other linguistic technologies had identified challenges in using different metrics when employed with participants at different literacy levels. So there's good reason to believe that we need to carefully evaluate the metrics before employing them with deaf and hard of hearing readers. And so the main research question in this study was, if we have texts that we know are at different levels of complexity, can a metric distinguish those different levels of complexity when evaluating them with deaf and hard of hearing readers? So this feels a little bit backwards from as compared to how evaluations of text simplification are typically done, because typically you don't know the complexity of the output and you want to evaluate that. But in this case, we're evaluating the metrics. So we knew the complexity of the text that we're evaluating, and we want to see whether the metrics can distinguish those different levels of complexity. And so in this study, we compared the efficacy of several metrics identified from prior work on the evaluation of complexity of automatically simplified text, which included reading speed, multiple choice comprehension questions, which we actually wrote at 2 different levels of linguistic complexity to identify whether varying the linguistic complexity of the question items themselves could affect their effectiveness for evaluating complexity of simplified text. We also asked participants to provide a prediction of how well they had done on the comprehension questions, which we called score prediction. And finally, we included subjective judgments identified for prior work, which included readability judgments, which read as this text was easy to read, and understandability judgments, which read as this text was easy to understand. And both of these subjective judgments were provided using a 5-point Likert scale of agreement, going from strongly disagree to strongly agree. And so how did our study work? So as I mentioned, the main thing was that we had texts that we knew to be at different complexity levels. And these were selected from Newsela, a website that professionally produces texts at different complexity levels. And we also had them evaluated by a deaf literacy expert to provide more evidence that these texts were indeed at different complexity levels. And so participants read through each of the texts and then responded to the metrics that I outlined in the previous slide. And so we had 54 deaf and hard of hearing participants participate in this study. And we grouped them into 2 groups based on their literacy levels. And the literacy levels were identified using the same test that we used in the previous study that I presented, the WRAT4. And so we had 2 groups of 27 participants. And this was done to identify whether the literacy levels of the participants also affected the effectiveness of the metrics for evaluating complexity. And so before I show you the results, let me show you how the analysis work and how to interpret the results. So because we knew the texts to be at different levels of complexity, if when we analyzed the results, we saw significant differences between those complexity levels, then we could conclude that that metric worked for evaluating complexity of simplified text. Now, if we didn't observe any significant differences, a difference that we knew to be true, then we could conclude that that metric doesn't work for evaluating complexity. And so let me present you which metrics worked best in our study. So if you recall, I mentioned that we wrote 2 versions of each comprehension question that varied in their level of linguistic complexity. And so the low linguistic complexity comprehension questions were able to determine the difference between the low complexity texts and the high complexity texts, but only among the lower literacy group. So among the higher literacy group, these low linguistic complexity comprehension questions were not able to tell any differences between the complexity of the texts. Now, the readability judgments, which were a 5-point Likert scale responding to the statement, "This text was easy to read," we're actually able to tell the difference between the low and the medium complexity texts, and also between the low and the high for the lower literacy group. And for the higher literacy group, it was able to tell the difference between the low and the high complexity texts. And in fact, this was the only metric that from the ones that we evaluated that was able to tell any differences with the higher literacy group. We also had a second research question in this study that we explored that explore whether the literacy level of the participants influenced their responses to these metrics. So to explore this question, we grouped all of the responses for the different complexity levels from each group, so from the higher literacy group and the lower literacy group, and then compared those responses to see if there were any significant differences between the groups and determine whether the literacy level of the participants did influence their responses to these metrics. And what we found was that across the board for all the metrics that we employed, participants with higher literacy scored higher or provided more positive subjective judgments than the lower literacy groups. And so this is an example for with the low linguistic complexity comprehension questions, where you can see that there was a significant differences between the responses for the higher literacy group and the lower literacy group. Now, this does not necessarily mean that these metrics are bad. What this suggests is that when these metrics are employed for evaluating the complexity of simplified texts with deaf and hard of hearing adults, the literacy levels of the participants need to be carefully reported to allow for comparison between studies, because the literacy level of participants does affect their responses to these metrics. So the contributions from this study include methodological guidance for metrics that are effective for evaluating text complexity with deaf and hard of hearing readers at various literacy levels. We also highlight the importance of reporting participants' literacy level when employing any of these metrics, including in our study. Otherwise, it's not possible to compare the results between published papers. Now, a key avenue for future work and a key limitation from this study is that we only studied one aspect of the output of text simplification, but there are other aspects of the quality of the output of text simplification, including the grammatical correctness of the output and how well it preserved the meaning from the original text. And so future work is needed to identify appropriate metrics to evaluate these other aspects of quality among deaf and hard of hearing readers. And so that concludes the summary of the 3 studies that I wanted to present today. And so in conclusion, this work that I've presented illustrates how HCI researchers can contribute to progress in automatic text simplification, providing useful guidance and methodological tools for natural language processing researchers. And this is done by answering questions such as whether there's interest and need from the specific user group in automatic text simplification tools, what features do they prefer in reading assistance tools, and also what are the best metric to use in a study with the specific group, what participant characteristics should we report or should researchers report with their results. And beyond the specific findings that we have with deaf and hard of hearing readers, it is our hope that this also motivates research with other user groups to answer these questions and support automatic text simplification researchers working on technologies to support those user groups. And the other things that I want to highlight is that there are important benefits from including target users, not only in the user studies, but also as members and leaders of our research teams to ensure that we're creating technologies that address real needs from these user groups. And so as I mentioned throughout the studies, this work was done in collaboration with numerous collaborators, including other PhD students at the Care Lab, master students, other faculty members, some of whom I see in the participants list, and my advisor, Matt Unnerfeld. So I want to thank you all for your support in this work. And then I want to also thank the National Science Foundation for the support of this work. And with that, I thank you, the audience, for attending today, and I'll be happy to take any questions.